Welcome to the Disrupt Education podcast. Alli, how are you doing?
I am well, Peter. It is a holiday eve. This won't come out, Thanksgiving week, but for those celebrating around the world, happy belated Thanksgiving.
Yes, we're proactive. We get things done before the post. Um, what have you been up to lately? You've been still jumping onto planes and such, no?
I'll have been doing that. Trying to get my coach rating currently. That's the current aspiration, so I can help other people get into the sport of skydiving. So I jumped like 13 times 2 weekends ago. It was great. It's a
It's
great
cold.
weekend.
I feel like it's cold. It's cold when you do that.
So it's considered winter jumping. Here
Yeah.
in Wisconsin, most drop zones actually like shut down this time of year,
Hmm.
but the owners of the drop zone here love to jump. And as long as it's like above 30 degrees, they will do it. I think it's invigorating. Some of my skydiving friends think I'm not normal, but because, that's fine. Even then they're like, it's so cold. And I mean, they're like, well, you're a new jumper, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe it's all the adrenaline, but you know what? Go big or go home.
Yeah,
Jump
right.
all
Honestly, if
year
any of
long.
our listeners want to connect with Alli, check the notes. They're all there. You can ask her all about that. But we have a great guest today. Dan Farley is with us. He's the assistant superintendent in Oregon, and I'm going to call it Radar. And I'm going to let you explain that. But Dan, how are you doing?
Doing well, Peter and Alli. Thank you for having me here. And RADAR stands for Research Assessment, Data Accountability, and Reporting.
We got to jump right into that. So,
Sounds
what does
good.
that entail first? And then we'll dive into your kind of history because you have a unique, you've taught, we had a conversation right before the podcast. You've taught almost everything, maybe everything in K through 12. So, talk a little bit about your position now. What does that mean? And then kind of go back into your educational path.
So the Office of Radar is a new office that I'm being allowed to help design and co-create with other directors and staff at ODE. I have basically two central charges, both of which are really exciting. One of which is to infuse data justice principles into the ways that our entire agency collects data, maintains or stores data, and then shares data, of course, and then also reports data. And all of those processes are implicated and need to be informed by community values. And we certainly don't have a structure for that work to actually be done right now. So that's one of the charges that I'm really looking forward to leaning into. The other is to coordinate our research activities across the agency. We currently have a lot of research going on, both in partnership with universities, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the podcast, but also internally because we have research analysts on staff. But there's no way of making our approach to research coherent. There's no overall research plan. So that is also part of what I've been asked to get started
I
and
love
work
that.
on.
It's sandbox. I think that's the disruptive part about this. Before we dive into more of that and how you're being a disruptor, in a good way, of course, tell us a little bit about like your teaching past. What does
Yeah,
that look like?
yeah. I was pre NCLB. That tells you a little how old I am. But so I didn't have to be highly qualified in any of these areas, and I was new to teaching. And for those of you who have been teachers, the newer you are, the more quote unquote opportunities you're exposed to. So I've taught courses literally from K to 22 now,
Wow.
ranging from introduction to French, to physical education, to world history, to pre-calculus, pre-AP English. I've taught kids how to bowl. I've taught them how to jump over, the high jump bar, like anything, everything, coaching, parking lot duty, you name it, I got to do it.
Alli, I think this is where we talk about some silos here. If he's been across them, what do you think?
I know. I honestly love the variety in what you speak of, like teaching maybe back when you started compared to when I started teaching. You couldn't just like flip flop around all these different fields. It requires much more certifications and testing, and in all of this. And so there are these bigger silos, but there's such like a richness in being able to go like in between these different topics. So I think that experience also probably helps you in your current roles in terms of seeing like the breadth of what we need to bring into a testing environment.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to say, we kind of hop into this, is that I met Dan at the Beyond Multiple Choice conference and was just really intrigued by how you were sharing about your talk on the true score fallacy. You want to give just like a little blip about that because it was really fascinating, and
Yeah,
it's
for
totally
sure.
like I was like, oh, Dan thinks about stuff differently.
You know, my experience at the university where I got my PhD at the University of Oregon in quantitative research methods within their education leadership program. But most of my actual work, I was working full time at the same time for the state of Oregon, developing their alternate assessment. So I had a very strong background in measurement. And what I've realized over time, I was also an educational diagnostician. So maybe jack of all trades and master of not too many. But in that work as a diagnostician and studying IQ tests and achievement tests, adaptive behavior, creativity or intelligence, et cetera, I realized that tests have error. You know, we don't measure anything perfectly ever. That's true when you're measuring a board. That's true when you're measuring your height. That's true when you're measuring your weight. So all of those measurements have error. And the true score fallacy, like the primary tenet of that, is just the fact that measurement error exists, and we also ignore it almost entirely in application. We treat scores as true and they're also perceived to be objective and scientific, and all of these other inappropriate adjectives that come along with quantitative scores. But it's like people don't question so much things that they don't understand. So when they get a scaled score and it's based on an IRT model, people are going to be like, "Ooh, that sounds impressive. I probably should trust that." And they don't know the degree to which they should trust that, nor do they understand really how most testing is probabilistic, not deterministic.
There's so much in there, right? Like, listening to Dan talk about this stuff is like and then you're actually in a role where you can that is heavily data based, right? And so I feel like it's a unique position for you to have this I don't know, ideology around testing and then have the ability to make changes on a pretty large scale, right? And so what would you say, like around, do you see yourself as a disruptor in education or like a change agent in education? And like, how would you classify yourself in that realm?
That's a really good question. I mean, I've always been interested in social justice. That's one of the reasons why I became an educator. But I think like being what you'd call the disruptor is really about, for me, just trying to honor the experiences of others and living into my full humanity as a person, as a human being. And the experiences that I've had have been various. So I've been able to kind of walk in different shoes in my career. But the shoes I've been walking in have been white male, dominant culture shoes. And I've been walking in systems that are designed to serve me. So kind of realizing that and also learning more both through my agency and through personal study about the actual full complete history of the United States has been really eye-opening. And I know some call that being woke. For me, it does feel like having my eyes open to something that I wasn't seeing, I wasn't noticing before. But there are a lot of important works I could point to. Certainly Dr. Kindy's How to Be an Anti-Racist, Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive, Heather McGee's The Sum of Us. Those are all really central to my lexicon, as is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So I just hadn't realized, and I wasn't taught in my schooling, how systematically the United States and the government have excluded persons of color from having access to and from maintaining and then, of course, expanding any form of wealth. It's been absolutely intentional, systematic, and successful, right? Power still resides where it used to. And so if doing work that fights that is being disruptive, then I suppose you could call me a disruptor, but all of that work also requires partnership.
I mean, there is this reality, right? And I'm going to kind of focus on the reality because reality isn't what it seems sometimes in education. I'll just leave that there. I'm going to be very generic on that statement because I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit. As you're moving through this, this moment of clarity, and then in this moment of how do we change? Everybody talks about turning the Titanic and all these different things, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a massive things. But what are some of the methods and tools that you're looking right now at and or implementing or experimenting with or what have you, learning about to connect that academia, whatever academia is now, and then the reality of it, because you and I know, like, a lot of people do not want to see that reality because we're uncomfortable with it and it's not what we're used to, and I can identify that as a white male as well. So, what are you looking at these days in that sandbox?
One of my favorite sayings is actually from Don Quixote, and it's not Don Quixote, it's Sancho Panza. He says, a lot of littles makes a much. So we might be making small changes, but depending upon where we are in the system, they have rippling impacts. So a change that I make with my team in Oregon that might seem small, and it might seem like it took us a really long time to get to it. Like, I'll give you one example. It took us 18 months to change a footnote and like one sentence in an official state scoring guide for writing to allow for gender neutral pronoun use. Like, that's one small change, but it has some rippling impacts on our systems and in terms of like the assumptions that people carry into their work. Mm-hmm. So I think systems change isn't the goal, right? I think we have a lot of political reinforcement of the fact that just change in and of itself is not always good. Mm-hmm. We also want the change to create a world that's more accessible and where opportunity is more available for all of our children. The challenge of how to make research and practice, like how to situate them so that they are mutually informing, has been a longstanding challenge in our education systems for sure. One of the steps that I took in Oregon to start heading a different direction, and you have to take one step, one direction, and then it leads to another, and then you start having this like just cavalry of steps, literally, is to look at our technical advisory committee. So we have TAC is the abbreviation for that, TAC. And that's a group of experts from all over the country who give us advice, recommendations around our measurement approaches in our state assessment system. So I designed our TAC, one, to represent a balanced assessment system. So we have experts in formative assessment practices, we have experts in interim assessment practices, and we have experts in summative practices. We also have TAC members who are expert in anti-racist assessment practices. So we were able to connect with Dr. Jennifer Randall in that space, and that was a really intentional move that can help us get better, because she's one of the lead thought partners and researchers in terms of anti-racist assessment practices. So one of the strategies is to surround yourself with people who are doing the work that you want to be doing, and that's what I did. But I did it through an advisory panel because I want the advice that I'm receiving also filtered through that lens first, before I hear it. And so that was a pretty important move. I mean, we're also trying to, these are all things that are built on relationships, and staff in positions like mine, where they're kind of political. They don't always last, depending on who the governor happens to be or what shifts occur in the legislature. So I think part of it is just making as much hay as you can while the sun is shining, and those systems are aligned. But we're trying to leverage our university partnerships more consistently, often through grant-funded activities. We are currently partnering, for example, with researchers at the University of Oregon on an IES research project. I'm principal investigator on that because it had to be funded through a state education agency. But it's looking at the efficacy of one of our high school success programs So that's based on relationship, and also connects research directly to practice, and also informs research by connecting with practitioners. So that's a mutually informing arrangement. And I don't see that being the case all the time. We're also trying to use using quite a bit of our ESSER 3 funding to look at both short and long-term learning challenges. And one of the research partnerships that we're working on in that space is with Oregon State University. We're developing theories of learning and a framework that educators and professional development purveyors can use over time in terms of literacy and numeracy instruction, specifically for students with disabilities and for students who are federally identified as English learners. And prior to that, as a result of the pandemic, I worked with a team to create Oregon Open Learning, which is a website of open educational resources, so that we could not just develop all of these high quality curricula and materials that can now be culturally responsive because we have control over their content, which we don't over publisher materials. But now we have a platform that we can all use to share those materials with anyone who wants to dial in over time, and they'll always be there. So that's kind of three ways that we have tried to kind of start developing a system that is going to trend that direction. And the more you can make that systemic, the harder it is to disrupt thereafter, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't want your disruption disrupted, which is part of the challenge we're facing right now too.
You don't. What's really interesting about your work as compared to probably a lot of our guests is how multi-dimensional yours is in terms of like policy and the level at which you can have these conversations, and it could have a bigger ripple effect. Because, and it's not that, like, I love what you said, you have to start where you're at and be okay with the small wins, and that any progress is better than no progress, and fighting for those types of changes. And there's nothing wrong with getting that footnote changed, and then also looking at these interweaving structures that you're trying to keep cemented that increases the educational, I don't know, kind of terrace or groundwork that you're laying that could impact generations worth of students. So because this is like really, really high level work, right? Like a lot of our guests are educators in a classroom, or mm-hmm. they are a company, or they're students, right? What would you say, to kind of our audience and people who aren't in this like kind of policy field of like, what are ways they can, I don't know that I ever worked with someone like you as an educator, right? In terms of like, that is making these big policy changes. I don't know if you have, Peter, but it's like, how could people like work with someone like you, not necessarily like directly, but that they what kind of platforms or channels are there to kind of open these doors? Because I'm listening to you and I'm like, this is really good stuff, and I like that you're being very intentional surrounding yourself with certain filters, but I'm not sure that that's the case in everyone who's like in a similar position to you, mm-hmm. right? So I'm just curious on, how do we keep those channels open? How do we allow policy to be changed? And like, now you don't want to inflood the system, but you also want to be able to have those types of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question can only be answered through, systems that support substantial, sustained education partner and sovereign tribe engagement, as well as community organization engagement. Because those are the ways that we are kind of steering our education agency toward, and we have relationships developed at present where we can get input and do some co-creation work, but they're kind of lucky relationships, I would call them, right? I happen to know somebody, or my colleague happens to know somebody, so it's not a system yet. So that's kind of what I really want to see happen, where it's not just like lucky relationships that drive the work. It's a systemic organization where people get paid to show up and share their experiences, their stories, educators, families, tribal members. I think that has been, to me, like the answer. Most of the most difficult challenges that I've faced in my career have felt difficult because they felt like they were mine, and they weren't mine. They were ours. I just didn't have the other people around me to help me solve that. And I think we can easily too fall into a trap. Like I taught in the classroom. I remember what that was like, but that was 20 years ago. I don't know what it's like right now. So we also have to maintain awareness that other people's lived experience, even if they're in the same role, it's totally different than ours, depending on their positionality, their power structure, perceptions about where they went to school, or whether their vocabulary is, intense or, impressive, etc. So it really is about just maintaining openness about others' experiences. And one thing that I've learned pretty deeply at ODE, which wasn't the case when I was in higher ed, which, that there's more than one way to look at any given event. And this is the important part for higher ed staff. All of those perspectives are correct. In higher education, we kind of learn and think that there is really one right way. And that way we expect to change in really small increments over time, maybe. But the more that I've experienced, policy and connecting across cultures, there are multiple ways of viewing the same experience. And they're only kind of correct to the degree that they're combined. And they are complementary. Another thing that's not true is that that they're always in conflict. They're not always in conflict. They're usually just looking at different sides of a challenge rather than being different interpretations of challenge.
This is how we know you're very deep into your work, Dan. It is very hard as I'm listening and comprehending as much as I can from my own lens. It's super exciting yet terrifying. I think one of the things we do in education, and we're kind of, I don't know, Alli, if we broke out of this somehow, but we're kind of like, but what if it goes wrong? And we're always like thinking that way, yet even if it goes wrong, as a business educator myself, that's where the opportunity lies, right? So, thinking about that, and man, it's difficult because I have my own children. I have a senior in high school. I have a freshman in high school. And this series was started on going beyond the score in education. Mm-hmm. What does going beyond the score mean to you and or your research in education? Because everybody, how you doing in school? I got a 4.0. What does that mean? I did really well on this, state test or this national test assessment. And also as a person helping somebody transition to post-secondary ed, it's still out there as well. So what does going beyond the score mean to you in education?
Yeah, I think big picture wise, the first thing I would point to in terms of like a framework to use to answer that question is that the scores that we're talking about, the assumption that is carried into that question is that they're quantitative, like it's quantitative information. So of course, the first thing we need to do is realize the limitations of quantitative information and be honest about those and talk about those when we're making decisions. I think the second thing is we need to add more qualitative information into the conversations that we're having as educators. And our accountability systems have focused over the last 20 years almost exclusively on academic outcomes, and we have ignored process and we have ignored inputs. So you don't have a systemic view if you're just looking at outcomes, because you don't know what the hell to do with them until you really understand what your processes are and what your inputs are. And you don't get that information without connecting with students and without using qualitative approaches to gathering additional information. So that's kind of the big picture framework I think I would use. I think the headline, the thing I think is most important in this conversation is equitable grading practices in the classroom. That's really to me where most of the biases in our system show up. And I know state summative assessments get a heck of a lot of attention in that conversation. And I think that's not even the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how our scoring in education in the United States is inequitable. It's more in the classroom every day, every minute that those biases are being reinforced. And that's not to like hand off my responsibility, at the state either. Like I'm trying to work on all of the above.
Right.
But again, back to I think the first question, like scores aren't sacrosanct and they're not objective, and they shouldn't be treated as such. And error in measure is really just a fact. It's a fact of life. Like there's oxygen and nitrogen in the air. It is something we have to deal with. So in Oregon, one example that I could point you to, there are a couple ways and moves that we're trying to make to really get at that concept that I named. During the pandemic, we developed a student survey called the Student Educational Equity Development Survey. And that survey centers student voice in our state assessment and accountability system in kind of a unique way at present. And I can't actually tell you where it might go. I've been kind of traveling under a if you build it, they will come mentality. And if you do good work and you show how it can be used and you convince people to use it, like then it's part of the system rather than, an NCLB top down, thou shalt sort of approach. So I don't have evidence that this will work. So when you talked about making mistakes and you talked about risk, there's a lot of risk in this work. I think the primary risk is building hope that will be dashed. That's the thing I'm probably most concerned about. But I also know that I would not feel comfortable sitting around and doing nothing and just letting the status quo roll forward because I see the harms in that every day. So the seed survey, though, just to get back to that one, because it's a really important part of what I have tried to do with colleagues at the department. It asks students questions about their opportunities to learn, their access to learning resources, their self-efficacy and beliefs about how well they understand different content areas, so reading, writing, math, and science. And then it also looks at their sense of belonging within their school and within their district. And we looked at additional indicators as well, but those are like the 4 constructs that stay the same across all grade levels. So we can start looking longitudinally with districts that have leaned into that process. We still have pretty low participation rates in that survey because it's optional. And there are some competing priorities, of course, anytime you are working in the system. Yeah. But hopefully we continue to kind of grow understanding that resource is available, show how districts who are engaged in that work are using it, and increase interest kind of organically from the bottom and up rather than the top down.
It's also, I will say, like listening to you speak and it's not, I don't hear that much about policymakers taking risks like you, which is amazing. And I think there is almost this, it is, I would say it's a good top down, if I could say it like that, right? Because if your leaders are taking those risks, then that also does, not to throw the rag and trickle down, but it does trickle down into, so you have this build from the bottom and up. The hamster wheel, though, Alli, how do we get more people in timeliness and such? But
I don't know. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about policy work in such a gray like space, and a gray space is good. It needs to be talked about, especially what you're presenting here with like scores are measures and measures of fallacy, and they're not end all be all like that. I think it's so ingrained in parents and communities and organization systems from like a large mass scale that it's beating that down to kind of open up the windows for other ways for us to assess and measure learning outcomes moving forward and where that goes. So we love to ask this question here, and it's really like, dream up your best, kind of educational system of the future. Sky's the limit. You can, whatever comes to mind. So like if you could imagine an educational system, whatever you want on it, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would people get out of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think this might sound odd to say, but my ideal education system wouldn't be designed by me. It wouldn't be designed by white males with my experiences. It would be designed by those whom our education systems have been harmed. I look at a system where members from sovereign tribes, members from disenfranchised communities by race, ethnicity, got together, talked about what their shared values are, how they could reflect that in curriculum standards and assessment practices. I know for sure there would be some coherence, with current practices, but that would actually be my ideal. What I've learned too, and some of the work that we're doing is, and if I get a chance, I can talk a little bit about what we're doing in our kindergarten assessment space, because that we have really tried to flip the script on how assessments even come to be and what they are and how they should be used. And that will also take some time to scale up as well. But the kindergarten assessment, I'll just talk about it. That was a good segue for myself. Okay.
I mean,
just talk
that's
about it.
important because I think one of the things, just to kind of preface it, and I think you're here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is mindset, right? We build mindset and not fixed mindset at that age, and how do we keep it all the way through, right?
So our kindergarten assessment historically was called the kindergarten readiness assessment at some points, and was misinterpreted by some as like, is your child ready for kindergarten or not? Like, your child's coming to kindergarten because they're 5. So that's not the question. The question is, is our system ready to support that student in learning the way that student needs to be supported, because the student is coming. So that was one kind of concern that existed, but it really looked at, pretty classical foundational skills approaches to literacy and numeracy, single digit, adding, letter sounds, letter names, the usual stuff. And the way that particular assessment was developed, it didn't actually include in the development process the student populations that it really needed to, particularly in the area had a behavioral component, so an observation component, where implicit biases, of course, showed up pretty strongly, we noted over time. So we kind of set that model aside. Our state board, the other thing I need to really name around risk taking is I'm not allowed to just take risks all by myself, right? I have to have support from my team, support from our leadership, support from the governor, support from educators at large. So I think in Oregon, I'm in a really unique space. I think I would have a lot more partners if other people were in a situation like I am in. So I don't believe in heroes. I believe in kind of collective activity. And I'm not like a savior or hero in any way. I'm just in a position where I can do this work. I think a lot of us would do this work if we could. So the kindergarten assessment went away from that. So we are actually connecting with community in the development phase. And we ask community members, kindergarten teachers, what do you want to know? What do you want your kindergarten teachers to know about your child when they start kindergarten? And we're also partnering with our early learning division in that process. And what was kind of like the resounding first step is, well, we really need to learn more about the funds of knowledge that kids and families are bringing to the classroom. Because, of course, what is good teaching? Finding out what students know, exposing them to something new, and then showing them how to map that new learning to what they already understand. So if you don't understand anything about what they already understand, how are you going to do that? So what we put in place in our piloting this year, and we're piloting again next year as we try to figure out how to scale it up, is a family interview process. So it's a pretty simple, short interview process where, schools learn a lot about families, not just like what brings the child joy, but what learning conditions the child benefits from, what languages are spoken in the home. So the school and the teacher are learning a lot of really important information about how that family needs to be supported in order to even access the system at all? Like, do I need an interpreter? And those are some questions that school districts don't find out oftentimes till, like, who knows when, right? The first time they have parent-teacher conferences, maybe. So starting off with that as your first educational move, meeting with families one-on-one and learning about what their child brings to the school in an asset-based frame, I hope will be game-changing. And we've heard from families and from teachers that it really has been an eye-opening and positive process so far. One family shared something really poignant, that they had never been invited to a conversation with a school for any of their children where they were asked what they knew about their child. Not once. And they had multiple older children who had been through the system. It was always them going to school so the teacher could tell the family what they knew about the child, right? So that needs to be a two-way communication channel, at least. And I think the family interview is really one step that direction. So hopefully it can be scaled. That's yet another risk. We don't know that we're going to get funding from the legislature to scale that up. We don't know if it'll have buy-in across different communities, because our communities are not resourced in the same ways right now. So anytime you build something, you have to be open to the fact that you don't understand all of the complexity that exists in the system, but you also have to trust that others have a lot of knowledge and skill that you will eventually be able to lean on, and you don't even know them yet, but the process will introduce you to them.
That is amazing right there, because that's such the human-centered approach rather than you got to fit into this system. I see it, and I know, Alli, you've seen it all the time. We're both high school educators, especially when a student moves from a different school, a different country, is any kind of shock to the system for an individual. And then we pile on, well, you got to fit into our culture and you have to fit into this. And I love how you preface that with, what the interview. I'm a huge component. I'm a huge believer in the component of, and maybe this isn't the right terminology, but a digital portfolio for a student and their family to build, so we can see who this person is, what they bring to the table throughout K through 12, in our case, maybe K through 16, or however you want to put that. I absolutely love that idea, because I can't teach any sort of curriculum without knowing who individuals are in my course. And it's the old, we want to force our students. I just talked to somebody about this today in our evaluation system, right? We want to force our students to comply, but if you're a great teacher, you're going to be able to make them, agile and flexible, and they're going to be able to have self-efficacy and all these other pieces. But the system is actually opposite of that. So I really am humbled to hear, how you're looking at things there. Alli, what do you think?
I'm always amazed at the variety of answers we get from this question. But I really like how your answer, it's different than most, in that it's the kindergarten. You might not think that is related, but it very much is so, because you're talking about dreaming up a system from when they enter and carrying that through, rather than waiting and bringing everybody to the table and having those discussions early on, so that everyone benefits, is on the same page from the get-go. So I just think it's a beautiful answer.
I want to give you a chance. Are we missing anything? Is there any other more highlights that you wanted to throw out there, Dan, before we give we let people connect with you and see, hey, how is this working, and how can people maybe even scale across the states a little earlier than we think we will?
Yeah, the only thing that I was kind of hoping to get an opportunity to talk about a little bit isn't necessarily something that's happening at ODE, but it is about how public education systems have been situated in our country, that I think has been really harmful And I also can't say that I have a whole lot of people who agree with me about this stance, but I'm going to name it anyway because I think it's important to talk about. And Lyndon Johnson framed our public education system as the central cog in the war against poverty. I think that was purveying a false assumption that education as a system could actually fix poverty. While it's true, of course, that education can shift opportunities within a social and cultural system through the work of building student skill and knowledge. That's what we do every day. It's also true that education in and of itself cannot fix all of the social and cultural and systemic inequities that have been literally nurtured by our government over time. And the government had practices in place that we are still dealing with. And by we, I don't necessarily mean white males like myself, but primarily people of color, including genocide, slavery, displacement, cultural erasure, redlining, predatory financial practices, suburbs that were designed specifically for white families. The impacts of those kinds of policies and practices are absolutely still with us. And I'm flummoxed that isn't a shared understanding in our country at this point. I am baffled. I'm not sure what hasn't been paid attention to yet. But I think part of it is we're not reading the right sources in our public school history classes specifically. That's changing, of course, since I was in a history class. That was a long time ago. But basically, I think we have a lot of work to do, those of us who are in the education system now, to educate ourselves about what the full history of our country is. And you're not going to get that without doing some deep reading and some exploration and finding other people who are having conversations. And you don't even know what you're missing until you read a different way of looking at what you experienced and realize oh my goodness, I got a very narrow and white-centric story of our so-called history. So I think that's something that I wanted to make sure I share. Congress has a substantial role in addressing poverty, and it's not just through our education systems. It's through redistribution of wealth in our country.
No, I think you're going to get a lot of listeners that are be like, yeah, right. These are uncomfortable conversations that we need to get comfortable with. Really, I mean that's the way I've seen it in my own privileged look, the way that I see it. But thank you for sharing that. And we appreciate the lens and the work that the entirety system of Oregon is taking a lead on. Alli, before we give Dan a shot here to kind of connect with everybody, what are your final thoughts?
Well, definitely connect with Dan. Yeah. Dan came ready for this episode in ways that, I was amazed in hearing a little 15-minute presentation. This is just going to blow people out of the waters. The work that you're doing is needed, and it's really, really deep, enriching work. And like I said earlier, I personally have never heard someone who is, in what would be labeled a more data-driven role, numerical, in lens, but you take such a humanistic and caring approach to it that I think opens so many doors and conversations that need to be had in the educational space. And so we're just really glad that we connected and got to continue this conversation today.
And so, Dan, how can people connect with you, some of the work that you're doing, and anything else that's going to help us see these comfortable, let's become comfortable with the uncomfortable situations and change education?
Yeah, thanks for both of those observations. I think the best way to probably get a hold of me in kind of a public and rather direct way just vanished because I deleted my Twitter account. But I can be found pretty readily. My email address is on the Oregon Department of Education's website. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And I try to respond to all emails within 24 hours. Ooh. Not always successful, but
that's a tough thing to do. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being here and sharing your journey, the sandbox, if you will. I'm excited coming away from this conversation, and we wish you the best. And we'll obviously check up a little bit later and see how some of these things are scaling. And we really appreciate you sharing that story.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Alli, for the invitation. It's great chatting with you.
Thank you all for listening. We appreciate you. Until next time, we'll see you on Disrupt Education.